Hey everybody, it's Natalie, your favorite neighborhood astrologer, coming to you live on Sunday. Thank you for being here with me today, and I am going to go ahead and make sure we've got the audio up and running correctly, and I can see the conversation as well in the live. And let me just go ahead and double check that. Okay. And if you end up joining the chat or joining the video later, I would love to hear your feedback, your comments. If you're here in the chat, you can definitely say hello. And let me go ahead and make sure that it is up and running. Yep. Okay, good. All right. Okay. Well, today I have a special treat for you guys on this very magical Sunday. And today we're going to be talking about the astrology of Kurt Cobain. And the video is called Would You Like to Hear My Voice Sprinkled with Emotion? And that is actually a line from a song that was actually by the Meat Puppets that Nirvana performed live on its 1993 MTV Unplugged video. And the song is called Oh Me, and it is, I think Nirvana performs it amazingly. And it really does kind of reflect like the Pisces side of him, the emotional side of him. And you'll see the glyphs underneath his picture there. We've got Mercury, Pisces, and Chiron, in which he did have a Mercury Chiron conjunction in his natal chart. And so we will be talking about that and the way that he sang and the emotions that he conveyed while he sang, and also the pain, the hurt, the suffering, the torture, everything that came through him as an artist. Now, it's interesting because we're at the end of Pisces season. We've moved into Aries season, and I wanted to do this video earlier during Pisces season when we had like a multiple of planets lined up in Pisces, and Saturn was there, and it was kind of a sad time, or maybe a reflective time, or a more emotional time, or a time where maybe you felt a little more withdrawn. And I think we're all kind of like reeling from that. And, we are coming into an eclipse here, which is happening on Monday. And then we have another one on April 8th. And so, the shit don't stop, everybody. And we are in that kind of vortex of emotion, particularly with a full moon lunar eclipse. We're definitely like, things are more emotional. People are more easily emotionally upset. And so, talking about our emotions and having a little therapy session about our emotions on this beautiful Sunday might be a good thing for all of us. And but we're going to go ahead and take a look at the astrology of Kurt Cobain. Now, originally, I became interested in his chart. Well, one, because it was Pisces season, and two, because I was having a lot of stomach pain over the last couple of weeks. And for those of you that know anything about Kurt Cobain, you know that he suffered from digestive issues, horrible stomach pain, and a lot of people said that he medicated with heroin as a way to handle his stomach pain. And a couple weeks ago, I had some of the most debilitating stomach pain that I've ever experienced in my life. And I was like, oh my gosh, if he is experiencing even 1/4 of that for like years and years and years on end, then, that is really bad. Like stomach pain, and every time you eat, because we have to eat to survive, and if we're having like burning in our stomach, or pain in our stomach, or our digestion is all funky and wonky, then it has a huge impact on life and well-being, and our mental health. And so, talking about some of the issues that Kurt Cobain dealt with, the pain, the physical pain that he dealt with, and his way of dealing with that physical pain. is something that we're going to talk about in this webcast, and is another reason why I kind of got interested in doing his chart as well. So if you're here in the chat and you want to say hi, feel free to say hi. And this is a picture of Kurt Cobain right here. I'm going to read a little bit about his life, and most of us are familiar with Nirvana, with his band. And Kurt Cobain was born February 20th, 1967. He died April 5th, 1994. From a gunshot wound, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, which is very, very sad. But he was an American musician who was the lead vocalist, guitarist, and primary songwriter and founding member of grunge rock band Nirvana. His angsty songwriting and anti-establishment persona and his compositions widened the thematic conventions of mainstream rock and roll music. He was heralded as a spokesman of Generation X and is widely considered to be one of the most influential alternative rock musicians of all time. And you guys may know his hits: Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Lithium in Bloom, Heart-Shaped Box. If you're here and you're a Nirvana fan, you can drop your favorite song by Nirvana and let me know like which one you really loved out of all of his songs. And I really loved his MTV Unplugged performance from 1993. And I know some of the songs he was performing in that were written by other bands or written by the Meat Puppets. And the Meat Puppets were performing with, a few of the members were performing with him at the time while he sang those on MTV Unplugged. But I personally love Lake of Fire and Oh Me. Like, those are two of my favorites. But of course, Heart-Shaped Box is amazing. Something in the Way, very sad song. But anyway, it talks about during his final years, Cobain struggled with heroin addiction and chronic depression. He also struggled with personal and professional pressures of fame and was often in the spotlight for his tumultuous marriage to fellow musician Courtney Love, with whom he had a daughter named Frances. In March of 1994, he overdosed on a combination of champagne and pills, subsequently undergoing an intervention and detox program. On April 8th, 1994, he was found dead in the greenhouse of his Seattle home at age 27. From an inflicted shotgun wound to the head. And I was alive during that time. I mean, obviously, I'm in my 40s, so I was definitely alive in 1994. And I remember when that happened and just how sad it was and how tough it was. And just over time, just how people have always remembered his memory. Now, let's go ahead and take a couple, look at a few pictures of him. Here he is right here with his MTV Unplugged performance. Here is him with other members of Nirvana, Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl, and there they are there. And here he is with his band members, Nirvana band members again. Here he is with Courtney Love back in the day. And here he is with him and Courtney with their baby. And here he is right here. I just thought that this was like, he was really quite small. Kurt Cobain was a Virgo rising, and he had trouble keeping weight on. And some of that was probably due to the issues that he had with his stomach at the time. Here's a picture of his wedding to Courtney Love. They got married in Hawaii, and what a Pisces picture, huh? With all the water and everything in the background there. And quite the Pisces picture. And of course, Kurt Cobain has always been associated with grunge and kind of the grunge look. And you can see kind of the baggy, oversized, ill-fitting clothing. Like, we'll talk more about grunge and, grunge as a musical style, as an artist, and also as like looking grunge, because it's very evident in his chart. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and begin with looking at the chart. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen his chart like dissected before or looked at before, but today I'm hopefully going to bring you guys a fresh perspective here and kind of looking at his chart. Now, I am using whole sign, and his ascendant is at 19 degrees Virgo. You will note that he has Pluto in an exact conjunction with his ascendant, and he also has Uranus right there too. And he was born in the Pluto Uranus generation, which Pluto and Uranus were in a conjunction from 1960 to 1972. And that was definitely a time of huge change and huge like social rebellion. And like that is when Gen X started coming in at that time too. So we're going to talk about the Pluto Uranus and Virgo generation and Pluto Uranus conjunctions in general. And because Kurt Cobain has Pluto and Uranus rising on his ascendant, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of people have referred to him as like the voice of a generation, which he hated. He absolutely didn't want to be referred to as that, but he kind of ended up being that with the Pluto Uranus signature there in his first house, and then opposite his Mercury, talking about being like the voice of a generation. And so that is there too. So we have that. We can see that he has Sun in Pisces, and he has like multiple planets in Pisces there. And he also has the moon in Cancer, very sensitive, very emotional. Okay, so he's got Earth rising and then his sun and moon in water. And you will note about his chart that he doesn't have a whole lot of fire in his chart. He does have a little bit of air, but, but not much. And actually, does he even have any air? Why did I even write that in my notes? No, he doesn't even have, I mean, his midheaven is in Gemini, but that's not a planet. So, no, he doesn't really have any air in his chart, and he's basically earth and water with a heavy emphasis on water. And he was very sensitive and emotional, and even his parents talked about him being like very sensitive, empathic, and emotional. A lot of people have pointed out the grand water trine in his chart, and I'll point it out here too in case you haven't seen it yet, but it is this Venus in Pisces, trine Jupiter in Cancer, trine Neptune in Scorpio. So can you see I'm doing the triangle there? So he has a grand water trine between Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune. Now, of course, his Venus in Pisces, we know that Venus as a planet is associated with arts and artistic works of art, musicians, actors. Venus does typify all those energies. So when we look at Venus as being a representative for art and music and beauty and all of that, we can see he has Venus at 26 degrees Pisces. And actually, Venus is exalted in Pisces. And some of you may or may not know this, but the planets all have exact exaltation degrees. And not only do they have a sign that they're exalted in, but they have a degree that they are exalted at. And his Venus is exalted in Pisces at exactly 27 degrees Pisces. So he is like 1 degree off of having a, exalted Venus to the degree. And, what an amazing artist, what an amazing visionary, what a feeler, what an emotive person, his emotions coming through his art. Art and beauty and love and compassion and everything that comes through there. Now, of course, Jupiter does rule the 4th house of family, and we see how important having a harmonious, loving, nurturing family is important to him as an artist, is important to him as having family support in his art and having a positive family, like how important that is for him. And we'll talk about how, Kurt was born with that, but later in life, and not too much later in life, when he was 9 years old, his parents divorced, and it created a lot of pain and suffering for him. And, but always kind of looking for that idealized version of family and connection and all of that and everything that he does. So we can see that aspect there with Jupiter ruling the 4th house of family. And let's see, what else did I want to talk about? So, a couple other things in his chart. And I'm going to erase everything and I'm going to talk about. So, we have Mars. We have Mars in Scorpio here in domicile. That's a very strong Mars. I'm just going to talk briefly about the planets. We also have Mercury in Pisces. Mercury is in fall in Pisces. And Mercury is also in a conjunction with Chiron there, which we can see. Venus exalted in Pisces. He also has the moon in Cancer, which the moon is at home in Cancer and in domicile. So he has quite a few really strong planets in his chart. And the weaker planet is actually his Mercury, which is the Mercury at 18 degrees Pisces. And because that Mercury rules his ascendant in Virgo, it looks like there's some things in his life that work out really well for him, but perhaps he is feeling weak or debilitated or heavy or unable to go on. It's like, for artists to have their band be successful is like, the number one thing that could happen to any person. But I think his debilitated Mercury conjunction Chiron does show like the physical pain, the emotional pain that he was in, and perhaps how even if things were quote unquote good around him, he may be feeling weaker or more disturbed in his environment, even if things quote unquote look good. And so we'll talk about that too. Now, I want to go ahead and talk about some quotes in his chart and talk about how those quotes, because I love doing this, going and finding quotes and then seeing how it does reflect in the chart. And we are going to take a look at that. Okay, so one thing we should know is that Kurt Cobain was very ahead of his time. He was very pro LGBTQ. He was a fierce advocate for women. And hi, Dolores. I see your comment there. What is your take on self-death? My take on it is that it's really, sad and disturbing and painful for everyone in their life. And the person must be going through an incredible amount of suffering in order to do that to themselves. And I don't have any, I would hope that we don't have a cruel enough universe to take somebody who's already suffering and do something even worse to their soul just because they, unalived themselves. That would be a pretty cruel God or a pretty cruel universe. So I can't really, I don't really partake in that view, because if people are like mentally struggling, then, that is already hard enough. I think it is very hard for the people that are left behind, though. And I did have an uncle in my family that took his own life, and he left my aunt behind. And, she was older and she was very bitter, very, very bitter about what he had done to her. She was just, she was older and she had gotten diagnosed with cancer. The cancer had come back, and, he just, I don't think he did it because of that. I don't really know all the reasons he did it, but there was a history of mental illness on his side of the family. And so, watching her struggle with the fact that he did that, of course, she was very angry, and rightfully so. But, and certainly for the widows and the children of people who have done this, this is a very, hard fate to undertake. But Dolores, I will be talking about what in his chart indicates that. Now, I want to be really careful with that too, because if you have the same thing in your chart, or if someone watching this does, I don't want them to be, worried or anything like that. But there was something that my Indian astrologer teacher taught me, and I have to say, I haven't really examined the charts of many people who have passed from suicide. And so I haven't, really looked, but I have to say this is the first chart that I really examined where someone died from a self-inflicted wound. And I do remember something that my Vedic astrology teacher told me, and it is true based on his chart, what she told me. So I'm going to explain that later when we get into his death and start talking about his death a little bit later on in the webcast. So I will share that later from like an astrological perspective. And anyway, so what's interesting about Kurt Cobain is he was very ahead of his time, and that is, with the Uranus on his ascendant there, like being very rebellious, like being not being like the other kids, thinking differently than other people. He had that kind of built in from him at birth, I think. He also was a friend to women and a fierce advocate for women. He was anti-rape. He was, he definitely related more to women. And you can see the ruler of his ascendant, which is this Mercury in Pisces here at 18 degrees Pisces, because he's a Virgo rising. The Mercury is the ruler of the ascendant, and that Mercury in Pisces is in a trine to the moon in Cancer. And, moon represents mother, emotions, and particularly if we're looking to see how does a man feel about women, or how does a man in a man's chart, how does he feel about women, or how does he feel about his own mother, or how does he all of that information, we would look to the moon. And moon is definitely a signifier for women in general in a chart too. And the ruler of his ascendant is trine that moon in Cancer. And so he was a great friend to women, and he hated bigots, and he hated homophobes, and he hated macho jocks and all of that. And we'll talk more about that as well. So that is evident in his chart. One of his quotes as well, that he had written in his suicide letter was, "It's better to burn out than to fade away." And when I think about water energy in Pisces, that can very much be like a fading out or a floating out, or like a fading away. That's a very Piscean type of a concept. But he said it's better to burn out than fade away. And he has his sun in Pisces trine Mars. Okay. And that Mars rules the 8th house of death in his chart. And so he's saying it's better to burn out than fade away. Sun trine Mars, Mars ruling the 8th house of longevity or death. And so I thought that comment was really interesting about that as well. Instead of just wasting away or fading away, it's like I'm going out, burning. I'm a light that's like burnt out instead of fading away. And he also, in his note that he left after he passed, he wrote that he had a goddess of a wife who sweats ambition and empathy. And, again, this video isn't about other people's feelings towards Courtney Love. It's about, his feelings towards Courtney Love. I know a lot of people don't like her, and a lot of people think, she was really bad for him, or even worse, that she had something to do with his death and all of that. But, and I'm not here to comment on that or the conspiracy theories around that or anything. I'm just telling you, how he wrote about her in his letter. And we'll notice that Jupiter rules the 7th house of partnership. So we find Jupiter at 25 degrees Cancer retrograde in his 11th house. And that Jupiter is in a trine to the ruler of his ascendant. And so you see he's talking about his wife in a very favorable way in the letter. He says he has a goddess of a wife who sweats ambition and empathy. Now, if we're talking about somebody with ambition and empathy, ambition would be Jupiter and empathy would be Cancer. Okay. And I have a goddess of a wife who sweats ambition and empathy. Okay. And that is how he saw her. And, so we can already tell, he really does favor the feminine over that macho, masculine kind of frat boy type of energy. He really, really leans more towards the feminine. And he also made a comment as well that he said, "My mother encouraged me to be artistic. It was written in a contract at an early age that I would be an artist. Okay. Now, again, the ruler of his ascendant is trine that moon in Cancer. So when we think about the moon representing mother, mother supporting me in the 11th house, mother supporting my creativity, mother encouraging me as an artist, right? And so he did. Later in life, there was issues between him and his mother after she got remarried. But he said early on, in his life, she always like encouraged him to be an artist and all of that. And he also wrote that he had a really good childhood up to the age 9. And then a classic case of divorce really affected him. His parents ended up getting divorced. But you can see he did have a nice early part of his childhood. We can see the ruler of the ascendant is trine that Jupiter, which also rules the 4th house of family. And the ruler of ascendant also trining that moon. So he said he had a good childhood up until his parents got divorced, probably kind of an idealistic childhood in a way. And there's a couple other astrologers that have pointed out, because the ruler of the 4th house is retrograde, Jupiter retrograde in Cancer, that situation was like turning around, or it didn't stay the same. And I thought that was a very interesting insight. But I'm also going to show you guys the transits later on that were happening at the time that his parents got divorced, and why that must have felt like so bad and rotten and awful to him. Because he always mentions either being 7 years old or 9 years old. 9 years old is when his parents got a divorce. But even in his note that he left when he passed, he wrote that he started hating humanity and hating people when he was 7 years old. And so we're going to look at what was happening to him from the ages of 7 to 9, transit wise, that would have made him, this happy-go-lucky, like I'm trying my moon in Cancer and I'm trying my Jupiter and my family. Like, what would make this happy-go-lucky, sensitive, empathic, artistic, like funny kid? What would make this kid turn like that and like hate humanity or be very angry towards humanity? And we will look at those transits later. And I think it just really points out the just the impact that transits can have on us, right? Because you could have a very lovely trine in your chart, but then it comes and it gets visited by a malefic or something like that, and it can really rock our worldview, because trines are more idealistic and they're more like seeking perfection and an ideal type of an environment. But when you have a malefic come along, and when I'm talking about malefics, I mean like Saturn and Mars come along and really dig into those trines, we see Kurt Cobain's world kind of like blowing up and causing problems. Okay, so we'll look at that too. Kurt Cobain also said, "I never wanted to sing. I just wanted to play rhythm guitar, hide in the back, and just play." Now, keep in mind, he's a Virgo rising, and he doesn't really have any fire in his chart. There's no, Leo here, anything. It's not like he's got multiple planets in Leo and he needs to be the center of the show or anything. He's definitely a Virgo rising. And particularly with Pluto on the ascendant too, like him talking about wanting to like hang out in the back and play rhythm guitar. Like he never really wanted to be a front man or like the lead singer or anything like that. He was very like, from what I read about him, he was very like shy at times, very Virgo rising. And then his Mercury in Pisces, very, reticent and shy and quieter and sensitive and that type of thing, rather than I need to be the center of attention or I have to be the star of the show. And I think that is very Virgo rising with Pluto on the ascendant, where he wanted to stay and hide in the background. And he also said, "I would like to get rid of homophobes, sexists, racists in our audience. I know they're out there and it really bothers me." He didn't want people like homophobes or people that hated women. Like he didn't want people like that going to his shows. And at one time in the middle of a show, he saw like a guy like like groping a woman out in the audience, and he stopped the show and he was like, "Get off of her," like, and you can see he does have a sun Mars trine there, so there is a part of him that could probably be, especially with the Pluto rising and the Uranus there too, that could pop off sometimes, or could get angry at times. And he was known to like stop the show and be like, stop. um he said, "I'm not gay, although I wish I were, just to piss off the homophobes," right? Sun trine Mars, but I also think that's his Mercury opposite Pluto and opposite Uranus. Just, I want to say and do things to piss people off, that make people uncomfortable, that are bigots and homophobes and stuff like that. So I thought that was pretty funny. And another really interesting quote that he made is, "I like to make people feel happy and superior in their reaction towards my appearance." And our appearance is really, the planet associated with our appearance is Venus, right? And he was a really good looking guy, actually. He had the bright blue eyes, the blonde hair, beautiful, like fascinating mind, all of that, right? And people were attracted to him, but he liked to dress very grungy, and he'd like to dress like downplay his appearance. And you can see his Venus is in a conjunction with Saturn, and Saturn is about, like feeling inferior, but he would do it in kind of a very mercurial way, or in a very tricky way. And what he's saying is, "I like to make people feel happy and superior in their reaction towards my appearance." So I like people to think that they're better looking than me, or better dressed than me, or that I'm just, whatever. And you can kind of see the Uranus Pluto there. Like, I don't really want to follow the rules. I don't want to look the same as other people. And I don't care if people think I look lowly and like a degenerate. Venus, Saturn, like, I don't care if people think I'm inferior or I look ugly. I don't really care. In fact, he kind of like got off on it, from what it sounds like. And he says, "I've always had a problem with the average macho man. They've always been a threat to me." Now, remember, he's a little bit smaller in stature. He is a Virgo rising. He's got Mercury in Pisces. He's got a lot of water, a lot of feminine energy in his chart. And so he doesn't like that macho kind of aggressive energy. And he says, "I've always been a really sickly feminine person anyhow, so I thought I was gay because I didn't find any of the girls in my high school attractive at all." And talking about being like a sickly feminine, we can see the Mercury in Pisces, which rules his ascendant, in a conjunction with that Chiron. So being like small and sickly and feeling very feminine. And then Venus Saturn can really be like an asexual Venus, particularly when he was younger, like not being attracted to women at his high school, and maybe even with the Virgo rising too, a sense of feeling with Uranus Pluto there, like outcast, and also like maybe asexual in a way, because Mercury, Virgo is a sign ruled by Mercury, and Mercury does have a way of being asexual. Like, Mercury can be a total flirt, but Mercury can also be very asexual. And particularly with his Venus, the planet of love, in a conjunction to Saturn, like not being attracted to the women in high school, not, for a long time thinking he was gay or asexual because he wasn't attracted to anything. And it wasn't until later in life that he started meeting different women like outside of his hometown, that he was like, "Oh, I guess I actually do like women." Anyway, he also said punk is musical freedom. It's saying and doing and playing whatever you want. Now, when we think about artists in general saying and playing and doing whatever they want, if we look at his Venus opposite Uranus there, that is like very, Uranus and Pluto could definitely, especially the Venus is opposite Pluto as well, like artists who are being like very out there, very underground, very punk. Uranus is a very punk type of a planet. Also, Mercury does have to do with youth, and with his Mercury opposite Uranus and Pluto too, I also think that just brings out like the young punk type of energy, because Mercury is associated with children or acting childish, and he used to do things like go around and spray paint things in his hometown with sayings like God is gay and stuff like that, just to piss off the conservative people. And so you can see that kind of young punk energy with the Mercury, Uranus, Pluto there too, like how he was kind of a young punk. And he also said, I use bits and pieces of other people's personalities to form my own. That's very Virgo Pisces in general. And he does have a lot here in Virgo and Pisces, to use bits and pieces of other people's personalities to kind of like form your own. That's very Pisces as well too. And so I think that comment makes sense. And another quote he is quoted as saying is, I hope I don't become so blissful that I become boring. Okay, look at the Venus trine Jupiter, trine Neptune, the grand trine there. He's picking up on it, right? I hope I don't become so blissful that I become boring. I think I'll always be neurotic enough to do something weird. Okay, the ruler of his ascendant opposite Uranus. I'll always be, neurotic or weird enough, because Uranus is really associated with being weird or being different. And he's saying, I hope I don't just become so like blissed out, Venus trine Jupiter, Neptune, that I forget like how to be weird and how to be different. And he also said that I think I simply love people too much, so much that it makes me feel fucking sad. And, that's the Venus trine Jupiter, trine Neptune. That's the grand trine there, where it's like, I love people too much, it makes me fucking sad. And the part that's making it sad is the Saturn part right there. Like thinking about losing someone, or thinking about not having that person in your life anymore. That is, or worrying that you're like not lovable and you don't deserve nice things, right? That's a very Venus Saturn type of a thing. But to love people so much and to be so empathetic with the Jupiter, Neptune, Venus trine, but at the same time making it you really sad because you love people that much, that's very Saturnian. And Dolores says, thanks, Natalie, my husband. Oh, I'm so sorry, Dolores. Yeah, for loved ones left behind. I'm so sorry to hear about your husband. That is, Dolores, it really made me think of, when you asked me that question, it made me think of my aunt and uncle. And yeah, I don't know. I was angry at my uncle too, like, because my aunt was going through her cancer came back, and it's just like, it's like, why at that time would he choose that time to leave her? And they didn't have any kids, so it was just them two, and he just kind of like left her alone. And anyway, I am so sorry about that, Dolores. I'm very sorry. It's a very cruel, and Dolores, I just like don't think that God is that, or the heavens, or whoever, whatever, God, goddess, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that would just be cruel to continue to punish people even more when they're in that much pain, and then they do that to themselves, and then to keep punishing them in an afterlife, that just seems extraordinary cruel. But I think the people that are like left behind, like always have a right to their emotions. Like if they're feeling angry or feeling abandoned or feeling like left, I would understand all of that, and I mean, far be it for me, like my understanding isn't the be all and end all anyway, right? Like everyone gets to have their own emotions and feelings about things. And Dolores, thank you for sharing your story on that. And yeah, so we will get to that aspect, and Kurt did leave behind a young daughter, and his wife at the time became a widow, and that I'm sure, led her to an even worse, like, downward spiral. And anyway, let's go ahead and we will take a look at. I wanted to talk a little bit about Uranus Pluto in general. And for those of you that Uranus Pluto conjunctions, as I mentioned, don't happen that often, and it is a generational thing when it happens. And there was a Uranus Pluto conjunction from 1960 to 1972. And, Kurt Cobain was born in 1967. So he was born in the middle of that conjunction. And we do know that, like, for those of you that have read Richard Tarnas and read some of his work as a astrologer focusing on, like, not mythological, but philosophy and world events and big changes in generations and documenting different outer planets and what they do. Anyway, he has an amazing book called Cosmos and Psyche, and he talks about the Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And I just want to mention it briefly because Kurt Cobain has it rising, and his comments about Uranus-Pluto conjunction is that it's instinctual and compelling, it's destructive, but there's also an urge for freedom there. There's a need to revolt from oppression, and there is rebellion against the establishment. When we see Uranus-Pluto configurations in history, we see a lot of radical change and the sudden empowerment of the young. He also wrote about Uranus-Pluto as being like erotic liberation. Uranus-Pluto has also been associated with the conjunction from 1845 to 1856. The conjunction in Aries was associated with the women's rights movement and feminism and civil rights at that time. And so I just think it's interesting that Uranus-Pluto conjunction historically has been associated with people who are, wanting radical change for oppressed people. And we also have the Uranus-Pluto opposition that happened during the French Revolution in 1787 to 1798. And so there's just so many instances in history, and Kurt Cobain is a part of that history of radical change and radical rebellion. And we all know, like, in the 1960s, there was, like, women's liberation, feminism, the pill, like, all started to come out and everything changed. And there was this new economic freedom for women, and there was free love. And, so he was born into that Uranus-Pluto conjunction. And as I mentioned, he has it rising. So it is very personal to him. And Kurt Cobain grew up in a very small town in Washington State that was basically a logging town. And it was full of, like, he hated, like, rednecks, and he hated, I don't know, maybe that's a derogatory term. I don't know if I should say that, but he hated, like, like people who were not, like, socially, like people who were very stuck in, like, the old times, and people who were not, like, socially liberal or liberated. And, he hated it, I think, when people weren't allowed to be themselves and speak their minds, is what I feel. Okay. And I also feel with the Uranus-Pluto there on his ascendant that he may have internalized a message growing up in a town full of, like, jocks and like macho kind of, like, behavior, that he may have internalized a message that he was weird and different and that no one liked him. And you can see, like, with the Mercury in Pisces opposite the ruler of his ascendant, opposite that Pluto Uranus, that he probably did struggle with internalizing those messages about you're weird, you're different, no one likes you, no one loves you, like, you're just off and you don't fit in. Like, and he came to be like a kind of like a person that, like, defended or stood up or was like a cultural figure for, like, the weirdos or the misfits or the people that, like, didn't fit in. And if you listen to Nirvana's, like, earlier albums, they were more punk than like In Utero and even Nevermind. And even his original band, like Fecal Matter, he had an original band called Fecal Matter. They were even like more raw and more punk. And you can see that Uranus, Pluto kind of punk in your face, fuck the establishment, like that type of vibe. And, as Nirvana went on, it wasn't as harshly punk like that, but his roots were definitely punk. And, anyway, so we've got that going on. Now I want to go ahead and I want to talk about a couple of, special planets in his chart that we will even talk about more later too, but I just really, I found it interesting. So we're going to take a quick look at some planets in his chart that I think are very special. And one of them is the Mercury in Pisces. Okay. Now, one thing I do when I look at charts is I always look to see if people were born around a station where a planet either stationed direct or stationed retrograde really close to their birthday. So for me, I was born really close towards a Saturn retrograde. And so you can, and also close to a Venus retrograde. So you can look at that in your own chart and look at a way to interpret that. Because if you're born around a time a planet stations, then that planet becomes extremely powerful in your chart, and it may slow down the results of that planet, or it may like exacerbate that planet or put that planet on crack even or just really, really slow it down depending on what the planet is and how the planet is interfacing with other planets in your chart. But I think that's something that is important, and I know it's something that is really important in Indian astrology and Vedic astrology, is looking at the speed of planets, and planets that are about to station retrograde or station direct, their planetary speed is going to be much slower, but they're also closer to Earth, so they're felt more powerfully. Now, what's interesting in Kurt Cobain's chart is that this Mercury in Pisces is direct at 18 degrees 27 minutes Pisces, but when 3 days after he was born, so on February 23rd, 3 days after he was born, Mercury went retrograde at 18 degrees Pisces at that same degree. So he was essentially born with a Mercury that was stationing retrograde at the exact same time that he was being born. That Mercury was getting ready to station retrograde. And I think that that's interesting because Mercury, when it's getting ready to station retrograde, is very, very slow. And Mercury is a planet that moves quickly. But when it's retrograde, it's moving very, very, very slow. And it was about to turn retrograde right after he was born. And one way I interpreted that, it's like his music and his lyrics. Okay, Mercury and Pisces, right? Music and lyrics. It's like his music and his lyrics and his art are like frozen in time in a way. It's like he exists, even though he's no longer on this planet and he left this planet very early. It's like the words that he said and the art that he did and the impact that he had. Because Mercury is the ruler of his ascendant as well, I think it's doubly important. And, that sense of like his emphasis and his influence is been like reverberating throughout time. And it's like it's standing still in time. If you go listen to a Nirvana record, it's like he's still here, but he's not. And it's this very like spooky, weird type of thing. And I think that Mercury is a very interesting planet for him. And, with Mercury in Pisces, like getting ready to station retrograde right after he was born, I also think that, Pisces has an energy of kind of like floating through life or kind of floating around. And I feel like for him, perhaps he felt like he didn't belong on planet Earth, or like that he was just supposed to be here for a short time, or that at times in his life he was like floating around without a home, or that he wasn't feeling attached to things, like on the earth plane, you know? And I think that like the feeling of floating in a liminal space without being attached to anything, that is a Mercury stationing retrograde type of a feeling in Pisces. Like, you know, floating through space and time with like nothing to really anchor you. And I think that his Mercury is like that. It's been stuck in a moment of time, and we can still hear his voice like echoing through time, and it's a very um interesting thing. And so I think that Mercury retrograde may have affected him. He has a very special Mercury, and it is in an opposition to Uranus. And his lyrics and his songwriting and the impact, like it was very, very powerful. And I think that Mercury says a lot there. And what's interesting is when I was preparing for this reading, multiple days in a row, I was waking up in the morning, and it was like I was listening to a lecture on Mercury in Pisces with Chiron opposite the ascendant. And it's like I was dreaming that night, and I kept getting shown that aspect in his chart over and over again. And it was like someone was trying to teach me about it and point at it and be like, that is what you need to look at. Mercury in Pisces, conjunction Chiron in Pisces opposite his ascendant, and the sense of floating in the world without a home, and the pain and the wounds that he felt as a result of that, you know, and feeling othered, or feeling like, or even just dealing with physical and emotional pain. And so I thought that was really interesting, because I kept waking up with that aspect on my mind. Like I'd been in a lecture hall listening to someone talk about that aspect. And I'm like, I wish I could remember what they said, but I couldn't. And I think that's so Mercury and Pisces anyway, like to not remember the words, but to remember the feeling. And anyway, I also think that this Mars is very powerful in his chart too, because that Mars, 16 days after he's born, that Mars goes retrograde at 3 degrees Scorpio. So he was born like a couple weeks before a Mars retrograde. And Mars retrogrades are a little more unusual than the Mercury retrogrades, and they don't happen as often. So I also think that this Mars is a very powerful Mars, and we're going to talk more about, you know, what this Mars signifies in his chart. But it also, Mars was pretty much stationary when he was born as well, which we know that he wanted nothing to do with like the macho masculine type of energy. And Mars in Scorpio, if it doesn't have somewhere to put its anger or its emotion, can become very self-destructive to self. And so we're going to talk about that, and talk about how that may have shown up in his life. Also, I would like to point out here too that in his chart, Venus is an evening star. Now, Venus can either be a morning star or an evening star, but in his chart, Venus is an evening star because Venus is ahead of the sun in zodiacal degrees in the zodiac. And so his Venus being an evening star, his Venus is more feminine, passive, protective, slower, flows without effort, but it also is like more of a, it's not a go out and seeking type of a Venus. It's more of a holding on to what you've got. And, you know, we talked about how he has that Venus with Saturn, and he wasn't attracted to women in high school. He thought he was gay. It was a very asexual Venus with the Venus Saturn. So very powerful Venus, but he does have an evening star Venus and is more passive. And he talked about that in his relationship, even with Courtney Love. Like, she was much more like, she would get on people if they weren't, if the record or the label or their manager wasn't doing something, he would kind of take a back seat and would be afraid to say something, and she would kind of like, jump on him and be like, you need to get this done for Kurt, So he had a more feminine, passive evening star Venus. And we also know that Venus, as we've mentioned multiple times, is connected to Jupiter and Neptune. So a lot of feminine energy pouring through him in that regard. Protective, caring, wanting to connect. But it's really interesting because in that song, Oh Me, in their 1993 MTV Unplugged performance, he sings these lyrics, and I just thought it was so like represented the Venus, Jupiter, Neptune trine like so well. The lyrics that he sings at that time are, I don't have to think, I only have to do it. The result is always perfect, but that's old news. And I just thought that was so cool because I think that as an artist, that kind of talks about how, like, it's like, I don't have to think, I only have to do it. The result is always perfect. But that's old news. And then he goes on to say, would you like to hear my voice sprinkled with emotion, which is definitely the Mercury Pisces with the Chiron. So I thought you guys might find that interesting with the lyrics. I thought that was fascinating too. And, one thing I also wanted to point out with this chart too, if we're analyzing the planets on a deeper level, is that this is technically a night chart, because the sun is below the descendant there. And so Venus is going to be the best planet and Saturn is going to be the worst planet in the chart. And it's like he found this wonderful success as an artist, but he also hated it, and he hated being famous. Now, when I talk about his Venus being conjunction the out of sect malefic, he said he felt guilty for not liking being a rock star, and that he felt guilty that he felt bad that he didn't really like his success. And he said that he was a very reluctant rock star. He was a very secluded and reclusive rock star. Performing for crowds for him got very old, and performing in general got very old for him. Crowds get old. Everything gets old. And a pessimism kind of settles over him. And I think that that's really interesting with the Saturn, because if you talk about like an artist who's having a hard time with success, you could talk about Venus Saturn, and you could talk about, being reluctant as an artist to kind of go in front of crowds or kind of like be a rock star or whatever, to this very reluctant, reclusive rock star. Now, at one point, him and Courtney Love, he's like, I'm not going to work for a while. And him and Courtney Love just took off together and did heroin together for like 6 months during the middle of the band, like getting famous. And, that kind of like, not really wanting to be a part of all of that, and finding the crowds and the noise very overwhelming. Like that could definitely be like the Venus Saturn for him there. That very reluctant, reclusive rock star performing is getting old. I'm getting pessimistic. I don't want to do this anymore. I feel trapped by my art. And if you look at it, it's interesting in his chart, because if we look at the chart of artists, we generally take a look at the fifth house, as the fifth house represents, artists and performers and things like that. And that fifth house is represented by that Saturn in Pisces. And, while he's an amazing artist, he doesn't like it. There's something about it that feels very off to him, and he feels bad and guilty for not enjoying it more. Anyway, so we've got that going on. Now I want to go ahead and I'd like to move on to his Virgo Ascendant and talk about that in a little more detail. So let's talk about him being a Virgo rising. I'm going to take a little drink here. And anyway, in my research of Kurt Cobain, I found out that when he, as an artist, that he was into like weird dolls, and also liked creepy medical devices, and that at one point, once he had more money, he went to a store in the mall that had like weird old medical devices and like bought a bunch of like weird, weird stuff. And I think that like that is so Virgo. And he often like he named his first band that he had Fecal Matter. And there can be like an obsession sometimes with Virgo with like bowel movements, and an obsession with like gross out like bodily behaviors, and those stores that sell like old torture medical devices. I mean, I think that's so Pluto and Virgo in the first house. And he also liked, making dolls, or liked weird, creepy dolls, or liked making dolls. And I just think that that's kind of Virgo. I think that that's a pretty Virgo thing. Like old torturous medical devices. He said at one point that he was actually really interested in like how the human body functioned, and because of all of his medical problems, that he was like very interested in that. And I could see him collecting and buying like haunted objects as well. If you see, Neptune in Scorpio sextile his ascendant, like going and finding, haunted objects and buying them, buying objects that are like weird medical devices. That is just very Virgo. And, Virgo energy is kind of funny sometimes because like some Virgos get very grossed out by things. Other Virgos have like a very strong stomach, and they can like, that's why a lot of Virgos work in healthcare, or some of them do work in healthcare, and they do like nursing or doctors, or that type of thing. And they see a lot more bodily fluids than the rest of us do. But it's so funny because I'm wondering if growing up, if he, or even when he was like on drugs, perhaps, because a lot of people when they're on drugs, they like pick at their skin, or they pick their scabs. Like that's a very, picking and obsessive picking and stuff like that is very Virgo. And I did see a video of him with Courtney Love where they were pretty messed up and using, and it looks like his skin was pretty broken out and looked like he'd been picking. And, not to get too into it, but just to kind of say, I think that Virgo side of him was very there too. And perhaps like the obsessive thinking about things and worrying about things was detrimental too. And but anyway, Virgo energy in some cases can be like picking at scabs, or I don't know why I wrote this down, but like watching insects die for hours trapped in a glass bottle until the heat rising from the sun kills it, like just sitting there and watching it. Like it's a very Virgo type of a thing to do, just like out of curiosity, watching something like that. And I wonder if he had ways about that he would kind of get like observer of human behavior. There's this scene in one of the movies, Montage of Heck, where Dave Grohl says something to Courtney Love about her hair, and she's like, fuck you, and like screams, and he kind of, or she tells him to fuck off and screams and like walks away. And you just see Kurt sitting there on the stage, and he gets like a funny like half smile smirk, and he's like like he thinks it's really funny. And you can kind of get like that mercurial energy from him, opposite Pluto Uranus, where maybe he likes it sometimes when people like freak out or act a little weird or act a little off. Like it's amusing to him in a way. Because I think maybe he did like chaos sometimes, and I don't know, like, speaking of Virgos and Virgo risings, I don't know if you guys ever saw Breaking Bad, and the character on Breaking Bad, Walter White, and how his character on Breaking Bad was a Virgo. And his character is like so Virgo, of course. And he's like this technical wizard who's making, a methamphetamine. But anyway, at one episode, he's trying to kill a fly in his lab that has gotten out, and at one point he falls on the ground, and the fly is like still buzzing around him, and he can't move, but the fly is just buzzing around him. And I just think the episode is called The Fly, and I just think it's funny because I wonder if Kurt had that kind of a thing too, or if there are things that he could be obsessive about, especially when it came to the music or the way that he saw things at times. But I think that Virgo rising piece of him is quite interesting. And so it made me think of Walter White in that episode with the fly. But moving on. So next, I want to talk a little bit about the Venus Saturn Chiron conjunction, because in his chart, we talked about how Venus is actually the best planet in his chart because it's a night chart, and Saturn is the worst, and they are together. So it's like I get everything I want as an artist, but I also hate it. The other thing too with the Venus Saturn is a lot of people hated Courtney Love. They thought that she wasn't a good influence on him. Even just a lot of fans like hated her. And, you know, this whole thing of I'm in a relationship with someone that everyone hates is very Venus Saturn. But you could also see the Venus Saturn Chiron in Pisces. I think him and Courtney Love also were like wounded in similar areas in life. Like she had a very rejecting family. Kurt Cobain experienced a lot of rejection as a kid, going from, you know, house to house and being kicked out, and this sense of like clinging on to each other but having the same like wounds as each other, but then connecting around that. I wonder if that was very powerful for him. I can also see too that Venus is ruling that second house of money, and the fifth house is of course our creative projects and our creative work, and all of that money and all of that creativity is being funneled to the seventh house of relationships. And I do think Courtney Love was involved with the money, and to an extent maybe controlled some of that. Or I do think even when Kurt was alive, like she would get involved with stuff having to do with the band and the creative stuff and the money. And perhaps that was another reason that people like didn't like her or thought that she you know, wasn't a good influence. But I also get the impression from the comments that Kurt Cobain has made that he wanted her involved. And I also think it's interesting, too, that the fifth house rules children and the second house rules money, and they're both going to the seventh house. And all of Kurt Cobain's money has basically gone to his child and to his wife, and it all was basically funneled through his wife in the seventh house, who then, you know, his daughter got the money, ended up getting the money after he passed. But I think that that's kind of interesting there too, and perhaps how she was involved with the money, or how she was a pain in the ass maybe to other people when it came to the money, and that may have been, or just the creative direction of things. I don't want things to go that way. I want them to be done this way type of thing, especially after he passed. It seems like she might have had a big influence on that. And perhaps that's another reason that people did not like Courtney Love. Okay. And, but anyway, I also read a story about how when Kurt Cobain was younger, how he had in school created some art and made some really ugly art of Ronald Reagan and depicted Ronald Reagan in a bad light. And his teacher refused to like hang it up in the hallway, or refused to like appreciate the art, and was like, oh, you shouldn't be painting Ronald Reagan in like a bad light or whatever. And so you can see where Venus Saturn could be like creating ugly art, or even when he was younger, like people refusing to hang up his art because he had been drawing and painting and doing all kinds of art from the time that he was very, very young. And there are a couple stories about his teachers being like, oh, this is ugly, like we can't, you know, hang it up or whatever. And that whole thing of, you know, art having to be, art having to be pretty. Like art isn't always pretty. Like sometimes art is ugly or dingy or dark or dusty or musty. And I think, you know, grunge rock really showed us where art and like music, art, you know, painting, like ugly art there's a place for ugly art in society as well too, right? And that whole sense of, and he must have, you know, his Mercury opposite Uranus Pluto must have really gotten, a kick out of like making ugly art and maybe probably making them uncomfortable. I will also say too, with Venus Saturn can also talk about timeless art, and Kurt Cobain certainly created through Nirvana, like created timeless art that lives on forever. And like, Saturn, like things that are tested by Saturn are really tested by time. And even, 30 years later, like people are still rocking out to Nirvana. And so I think he really did create that timeless art as well. And but there were also times that he neglected his art in order to be with Courtney. And he has the Venus Saturn conjunction in the seventh house, so it's like he needs the relationship in order to function, but also the relationship maybe at times wasn't good for either of them. And pulled them down, both of them, but at the same time, there's this sense of clinging on to each other and needing each other that I think is also there too. And speaking about, like a lot of people too, it's interesting with Courtney Love because Venus Saturn in the seventh house, like I have a partner that people don't like or people think my partner's ugly. A lot of people have like really strong opinions about Courtney Love's looks too. And they're like, she's not even pretty, and stuff like that. It's like, I mean, he must have thought she was because he, was in love with her. But again, it's like people are not flattered by my partner. They don't like my partner, Venus, Saturn in the seventh house, or they think my partner's ugly. So that kind of shows up there too. Also, I think with the Venus Saturn, it's a good time to talk about the grunge movement in general. And speaking of grunge in general, so grunge in general, when we think of the word grunge, grunge is very Saturnian. Like when we think of dark, damp, musty, grungy, like places like that, it's a very Saturnian, like Saturnian energy is very much like a dark, dingy hole or like that type of stuff. And so I'm not being very good with my words today. It's definitely Mercury and Pisces time. Actually, I think didn't Mercury move into Aries? But anyway, we're talking about this chart, Mercury and Pisces. But grunge has that Saturnian feel, and we talk about the word grunge. Talking about art that is very grungy or art that's very dirty, right? Venus, Saturn, dirty, grungy art. And grunge, I wrote down some words for grunge, like grubby, scabby, smelly, dark, dank, greasy. Like Kurt Cobain's hair always looked like kind of greasy all the time too. Punk, anti-effort, don't care about my appearance, Venus, Saturn, not gonna wash my hair. Venus, Saturn, depressed, ugly, dirt, filth, rubbish, trash. Grungy is inferior quality, right? So something that has like a lower quality or is inferior. And grunge can also be associated with what's tattered and baggy and ill-fitting. And I read you guys that earlier quote from Kurt Cobain about how he likes to make other people feel superior because they look better than him. And I think that's so Venus and Saturn and Pisces. Like, but anyway, and about how I like people to think I'm ugly. Like, I get joy out of people thinking I'm like unwashed or dirty or smelly or that type of thing. So you can really see, even though like a bunch of other grunge bands came out of Seattle at the time, like Kurt Cobain is really associated with like the grungy kind of the grunge movement in general. And that whole Venus Saturn and my appearance is very grungy and greasy and all of that. And so anyway, I thought that was interesting with the grunge and the appearance of looking grungy together. You can also see too, like with Venus and Saturn in the 12th house, it's like me and my partner, we get into trouble together or we disappear or escape from reality together. And it's not good for me and it's not good for them, but here we are doing it type of a thing. And, anyway, so that is going on with the Venus Saturn. Now, I want to, do I want to talk about, well, I also just want to quickly mention that Venus rules the ninth house in this chart as well. We talked about Venus ruling the second house of money and Saturn ruling the fifth house of children, and how all the money from his career goes to his children, that's funneled through Courtney Love, and how she was also involved in the money and the creativity and all of that, and probably why people, that was annoying for people, that maybe she inserted herself that way in the business part of it. Thirsty, hey Thirsty, rock out, hey. And I love the alien vibe. I think Kurt Cobain would have approved of the alien vibe. In fact, he has that very like alien, like what's up, punk rock alien kind of energy going on about him. Thirsty, thank you for the comment. And I also just want to point out, like, Venus rules the ninth house, and the ninth house in astrology is associated with like foreign travel and like being gone, being overseas, foreign travel. I don't think he liked foreign travel at all, because that the ruler of the ninth house is in a conjunction with Saturn, which is the out of sect malefic in the chart. And truth be told, like, he legit had a breakdown in 1994. Like a few months before he passed, he was on tour with Nirvana in Europe. He was in like Spain and Rome and Germany. And he called Courtney Love from Spain and was like, I hate everything. I hate everyone. I don't want to be here. Like, he was really missing his daughter, and he was really missing Courtney, to the point where she flew out to Rome to be with him, because he was having like a very negative attitude towards being in Europe and being there touring. And you can see again, like, his ruler of his ascendant is in a trine to the moon. So it's like he actually enjoys more, like, probably being at home and being with family and being with his wife and being with his daughter. It's like, being overseas is like a pain in the ass for him, and he absolutely like hates it. Now he has to be there. We can see the part of fortune with Rahu. He needs to make money, so he's there, making money, promoting the album, but he absolutely hates it. And he complains to Courtney, like, I don't want to be here. This blows. Like, I want to be home with you guys. And we can also see Mars in the third house, because in the astrology chart, the third and the ninth house are both associated with travel. And so, Mars is in the third house. Again, he doesn't like it. He doesn't like to be away from home. Venus, the ruler of the ninth house with Saturn, he doesn't want to be away from his family. So when he was away from his family in a foreign country, he became severely depressed. Okay. The ruler of the ninth house in a conjunction with Saturn, he became massively depressed, traveling in a foreign country away from his wife and child. So I think that is and actually it triggered a chain of events that pretty much led to his death. He actually almost died in Rome and went into a coma in Rome. And so we'll talk more about that later. I'm also going to show you guys some locational astrology and show you that his Mars line runs through Rome. And so that was already going to be like a dangerous place for him anyway. And the fact that he, fell into a depression and just hated everything and wanted to quit Nirvana and all of that when he was overseas is really interesting, because that Venus rules the ninth, and it is in a conjunction with Saturn, which is the out of sect malefic. And so we do know that. Now, to talk a little bit more about I want to talk a bit about his moon, and then I want to talk about the Mercury Chiron. Okay, so he has, like I mentioned a few times already, he has this Mercury in Pisces trine the moon, and the moon also rules the 11th house and of his supporters and allies and friends. And truly, Kurt Cobain did like, the public loves him. The moon is also associated with the public and your ability to connect with the public. And his ability to connect through his emotions and writing, with the Mercury making the superior square there to the moon in Cancer, like his ability through his words to connect with audiences and connect with supporters, and to have the people that are listening to his audience, because the audience is really our 11th house, the people that support us and listen to us. And with the Mercury connecting to the moon that way, and that positive trine, like his words reaching his audience and it having a major emotional effect on him. I also think that at times he would seek out women that were very nurturing, or women that would help him financially, or women that would give him some type of benefit, as the 11th house is associated with benefit. And it is also a house of profit, and it is connected with the second house of money as well. And so there is a story about his first girlfriend, Tracy, who he was with back when he lived in Olympia, like way before Nirvana hit it big, way before Courtney Love, like all of that. He was with this woman named Tracy, and she does some interviews and talks about what it was like to be with him pre-Nirvana, and it's pretty clear from the interview that she was like financially supporting him, and that she was kind of like a mother figure to him. And because he had his mother had eventually kicked him out of the house and he wasn't able to live there anymore, like it's like he kind of went towards women that were nurturing figures, or that he found were nurturing figures. Now, keep in mind, Courtney Love herself is also like a double Cancer. She's sun in Cancer and moon in Cancer. And then he also has the moon in Cancer too. But even his like first serious girlfriend, Tracy, she just seems like a normal like lady. Now she's like, in her 50s, but they're interviewing her, and she seems like the relationship that those two had was very maternal, and like her being maternal towards him. And she also was like supporting him financially at the time while he was trying to be like an artist and make it as an artist. And he eventually did get a job as a janitor, which is very Virgo rising too, to get a job cleaning, or to be in a cleaning type profession, because Virgo is often associated with the cleaning and the fixing of things. And so him being a janitor is very interesting, but he was basically, I think kind of living off of her good graces for a while, with the Mercury trine the moon there. So you can see that moon is really, it's really positive for him in the way that he's connecting with people emotionally and empathetically, but it also, I think, talks about his search for the support and nurturing that he needed in the feminine. And, we all may look at Courtney Love and go, God, she doesn't seem that nurturing or supportive, but we're not inside their relationship, so we don't know. But his whole thing of like seeking out women who are nurturing and supportive towards him, I think is very evident in his chart as well. We also talked about him being a huge supporter of women, in the sense that he was, identified with the feminine. He was anti-rape. He was pro-LGBTQ, like, all the things on top of that. But I also think probably there were times in life where he like really relied on women, or was really reliant maybe in some ways too on receiving that nurturing energy from a woman. And let's go ahead. I want to talk a little bit about the Mercury Chiron, because I think the Mercury Chiron is really important in his chart. Mercury rules the ascendant, and Mercury is in a conjunction with Chiron. And so I talked about early how Kurt Cobain struggled with a lot of physical pain, health issues, gut issues, stomach issues. how he endured bullying in high school. Now, Chiron can be associated with physical wounds or physical pain or physical disabilities, but it could also can be associated with emotional and mental issues as well too, particularly around bullying and belonging. And what comes up around Chiron is Chiron in mythology. Chiron was actually abandoned by his parents for being too ugly. And he was raised by Apollo, not by his actual parents in mythology. And so with Chiron, we always talk about that like wound or the abandonment or the rejection of something. And Chiron really kind of behaves like a baby Saturn. And it's interesting because that Venus is in a conjunction with Chiron, talking about, being an artist is both beautiful and painful for him. Being born like he is with his sensitivities and just being successful is very, like, it's very painful for him in a lot of ways too. But that Mercury Chiron, really affecting him because growing up, as his parents divorced, he got like he would get sent to his mom's and then sent to his dad's and then to a friend's and then to his grandparents because as a result of the divorce, he had become, very moody and unruly and unstable. And, he just kept getting passed around to different people, and his family just kind of like eventually ended up kicking him out, and he did live homeless for a while. And there is this part of him, and he talks about it very openly, probably just where he felt very like rejected and abandoned. And that's a Chiron thing. And like, Venus and Pisces being very sensitive, but also feeling like unwanted with the Chiron there. And the Mercury with the Chiron too, because as we know in medical astrology, the ascendant has a lot to do with our health and our well-being, and his Mercury is debilitated in Pisces and in a conjunction with Chiron. And so, like the mental health or the emotional health there taking a hit. His Mercury is also opposite Uranus, and as a child, Kurt was very like hyperactive, and they ended up putting him on Ritalin for being hyperactive, and then at night they would put him on like a downer so that he could sleep. And how that messed with his mind at such a young age, going on Ritalin like that, and then being kicked out of the house because he's too much or he's too hyper, or like just how rejected he must have felt. And Chiron is sometimes where we are like ignored or forgotten or unwanted. And I think he felt that way by his family at times, like, ignored, forgotten, and unwanted. Chiron can also be where we feel a lot of shame and disgust, and we feel very orphaned. And, his escapism into Pisces, like taking drugs and escaping in order to escape those woundings and those feelings of being unloved. And, it's interesting because, and growing up in high school, it was said that people would bully him. He was small, he was different. That's a very Chiron experience too. And his bandmate, Chris Novoselic, said that Kurt had a particular thing about people humiliating him. And it was interesting because Chris Novoselic was like, oh, I'm actually okay if somebody wants to humiliate me, whatever, but he said Kurt had a major, like, if anybody would try to humiliate him in any way, the band, him, etc., like you would see like a rage come out in Kurt. And he said that was the one time where you would see that rage come out in him. And the moon is trine that Mars. Now it is a trine, but that Mars is in Scorpio. It's a very powerful Mars. And I wonder if that, sense of if he felt humiliated or cornered in any way, like his bandmate was saying, like if he would really like strike out at that time. He said that is when you would see like the rage come out. And I also think, probably the Mercury opposite Pluto, was a way, like he could probably say things to people that could be very cutting or very, um, if he wanted to, right? I mean, he wasn't a guy that was really like that, but you could see him sometimes, like he would get mad. There's that Mars in Scorpio with this South Node. It's like I'm trying to cut off my feelings of being mad, but I am really angry with that Mars K2 right there. Now, I think it's really interesting with the Mercury Pluto, the Mercury opposite Pluto, because there's this story of, well, actually, you know what? I'm going to wait to tell that story because that has to do more with the Mars. I'm going to wait on that one. Let's go back to the Virgo rising and the Chiron stuff, because the Chiron is also opposing his ascendant, and so is this Saturn, okay? And Saturn rules his sixth house of health and well-being. And, with the ascendant opposing Saturn, getting very depressed. And I also, with the Virgo rising, having issues with the bowels or having issues with the gut. Some people say that Kurt had IBS. And of course, the sixth house also has to do with how we process food and any food allergies, how we process food, etc. And the ruler of his sixth house is opposing his ascendant, and he is a Virgo rising. So he has that mind body, like gut connection going on. And, IBS can really IBS sometimes can come from trauma and depression. And I have written down here that IBS patients have visceral hypersensitivity that is exacerbated by stress and anxiety. And that IBS can be associated with anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation. And so, as a Virgo rising, because Virgo does rule like the intestines and the bowels, and Virgo is definitely associated with IBS and things like that. And so if he had that, and if he was struggling with that, particularly with the depression aspect of it, that may have been a contributing factor to what happened to him. And, the Chiron opposite his ascendant too is sometimes with Chiron, we just have like this wound, and it can be a physical wound. It could be an emotional wound, but no matter what we do, it won't go away easily. And there's no easy path to resolving it. And, he had a very difficult time. Eventually, he found medicine for his stomach, and his stomach did get better, but he probably was still dealing with the depression with the ascendant opposite Saturn there. Now, when I was looking for all his stomach issues, I was really thinking too, like maybe that moon is squaring Mars or something, but that moon is actually in a wide trine to Mars. But when you think about a burning stomach, I would definitely think Moon Mars. And, because oftentimes he said he did have a burning stomach, but maybe it was like more IBS related or more related to the processing of his food. But perhaps, but moon in Cancer, that can be a very sensitive tummy, or very sensitive to emotions, which then, affect your digestion, like all of that, moon in Cancer type of stuff. And so I just wanted to mention the burning stomach because I was curious to see, and I wondered if at the time when he started having burning stomach issues, if maybe he was having a Mars transit on his moon. I know I've had a lot of stomach issues this year, and in my own solar return chart, the Mars is on top of my moon, and I'm like, of course I'm having like major problems with my stomach and my eyes, because the eyes also have to do with the moon. So anyway, you guys don't need to hear all about my medical problems, but astrology does make sense. And I was kind of like, okay, does he have, I mean, he has a wide trine between the moon and Mars there, but I think the Virgo rising and the IBS and the ruler of the sixth house opposition and its Saturn, and the depression and the fatigue and all of that does play a major role in like stomach and digestive issues. And anyway, and lastly, I just wanted to point out with the Mercury Chiron conjunction that Kurt Cobain is often looked at as like an anti-hero, and I think that that is very like Chiron. Chiron definitely represents the anti-hero. And when we're talking about like anti-hero, anti-hero is someone who approaches achieving things in the world differently than other people. And the way that they approach things, society may deem as being unacceptable, but they're still guided by good intentions. And I think that that's so funny because, like, Kurt Cobain, like, when he was younger, like a young punk, he would go and spray paint everything. And he would spray paint, like, God is gay and like abort Christ. Like those were two things that he would spray paint. And and it's like, oh my gosh, you know? And I mean, he has good intentions in the sense that he doesn't want people to be discriminated against, and he is anti-racist, he's anti-homophobe, like, you know, he's got all that going for him, but the way he goes about it, like spray painting property and you know, things like that. It definitely has a very strong anti-hero vibe to it. And, you know, probably he was more comfortable being seen as like that kind of anti-hero figure than like some macho Superman, you know, hero, which he definitely was not comfortable with the macho crap. So anyway, and okay, so finally I want to get to, and I think this is something that I finally would like to get to the Mars issues in his third house, which is going to lead to what happened to him with his death, and also, you know, what happened in his family that caused him to be like kicked out from his family. And so we're going to talk now about the Mars in Scorpio in the third house. And I've listened to a couple astrologers do readings on his chart just out of curiosity, and not many of them have touched very much on the Mars in Scorpio or the Mars K2 conjunction. Now, this is a pretty wide conjunction here. It's like 9 degrees off, but it's close enough that I would say, oh, that because it's K2 and because that is such a powerful Mars, I would look at that as a Mars K2 conjunction. And when I say K2, I'm talking about the South Node, obviously, and or maybe not obviously, but yeah, I'm talking about the South Node. And but with the Mars in Scorpio, I want to talk a little bit about it because particularly with you know, Mars is, so first of all, let's look at Mars in Scorpio. Mars is in domicile in Scorpio. It's strong in Scorpio. It's a very, very strong. And, you know, Mars is also ruling his 8th house. Now, in astrology, the 8th house has to do with death. It has to do with longevity. It has to do with inheritance. But the 8th house was in ancient astrology kind of used as a way to say, like, how long is your life going to be, or could even predict the length of your life. We don't do that so much anymore in modern astrology. Like, we don't tell people, oh, this is when you're going to die. This is how you're going to die. Like, we don't normally do that. But I did want to share with you guys something that my Vedic astrology teacher taught me. And as I mentioned earlier, I haven't seen a lot of charts where people have passed from suicide. So I don't have a huge, you know, pool to pull from. But something really stood out to me in his chart with the Mars in Scorpio, because one thing that my Vedic astrology teacher taught me is that when there are connections between the 8th house and the 3rd house, and it can sometimes indicate people, particularly by transit, not necessarily natally, but also by transit, but maybe even natally too, because it's not like I have a huge sample here. But what she told me is that connections between the 3rd and the 8th house can sometimes show like you know, people who unalive themselves. And the reason why the 3rd house is, now we would all know why the 8th house would be associated with that. And there are some astrologers that will say, like, if the ruler of the 8th house is in the 1st house, it could indicate somebody that passes due to their own hand or due to, unaliving themselves. Like, some people have written that, but particularly in Vedic astrology, the connection between the third and the eighth house is important. And that's because the third house is the eighth house from the eighth house. And so if we count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, the third house is the eighth house from, or the eighth house is, the third house is the eighth house from the eighth house. And so it's using derived houses, but basically what it means is if you see a connection there, there could be somebody, who unalives themselves or, unfortunately passes in that way. We can see that Mars is the ruler of that eighth house, and the ruler of the eighth house is in the third house in domicile, very strong with the past life planet K2. And so, that is something that I was like, whoa, because I remember learning that in my Indian astrology class, but my teacher didn't show us a bunch of examples or anything. And so this is the first chart I've seen where I'm like, yeah, the ruler of the eighth house is in the third house and it's in domicile and it's strong. And it's with the past life planet K2. Okay. So to me, that was like, whoa, there is a connection between the eighth and the third house in this chart. And, he did take his own life. Now, the other thing that I think was really hard for Kurt Cobain is dealing with, the divorce of his parents, but then also, like, he did have a sister as well, but Mars in charts will signify brothers or stepbrothers as an association. And after his parents got divorced, his father remarried, and then all of a sudden he had 2 new stepkids, and then his stepmom and his dad had another child, a male child. And part of the reason that he couldn't be at his father's house, according to his father, was that he was bullying his siblings, or he was, like acting out against his step siblings and the new baby that they'd had together. Now, Kurt was pretty angry that his father, married again and had another baby, and that he had these step siblings. But you can see, if we think about the father in the chart as being the sun and the significator for the father is in a trine with the planet that represents the third house. Of course, the third house has to do with our siblings. So, Nebula. Hi, Nebula. You says, LOL, my third house ruler is conjunct my Venus, which rules my eighth house. Oh, Nebula. Oh, no. JK. No, definitely no. Well, and Venus, actually, that's my ninth. LOL. Just kidding. Okay, good. And Venus could also be the most, depending on the sect of your chart, Venus could also be like your, the strongest planet in your chart, or the most benefic. So it actually makes it good, actually, like Venus being conjunction your third house ruler, particularly with your ninth. I mean, a love of learning could definitely be there, Nebula. Thanks for commenting. But yeah, so, you see, like, the father is in a trine with the sibling, and perhaps, and Kurt's father was like one of those more macho guys, and Kurt hated that. Like, he wasn't into that. And so, perhaps Kurt's father was connecting with his sibling in a stronger way, and he felt that his father liked his sibling more than him, or he felt that his father just connected. Oh, no, it's okay. Wait, I had it right. It's the Aries Libra axis. Sorry, brain dead here. Aw. If you have Venus there, and Venus is the ruler of your eighth, that could also, and Venus is the most benefic planet, that could also indicate like that you're getting an amazing inheritance, So the eighth house isn't always like, I definitely want to, because the eighth house can have to do with inheritances and things like that. So hopefully, Nebula, yeah, it's actually like, that's why you got to really look at it carefully. It just really surprised me in this chart when my teacher was like, oh yeah, and mentioned that. And then I found it in Kurt Cobain's chart. I was like, whoa. Wait a second. And that's okay if you're feeling brain dead. Me too. Me too. We are in the eclipse zone right now. But anyway, so perhaps he had this feeling that his father, the sun trine the ruler of the third house, was actually connecting with his siblings or his stepbrothers more than him. And that really like pissed him off, or it really upset him. And, we're going to look at the transits that were happening when he was like, when his dad was leaving his mom and he was getting diagnosed with ADHD, and his dad always had an issue with Kurt. Like, they'd be out in public and Kurt would just be like saying whatever, like as a kid, like Mercury opposite Uranus, just being hyperactive or having a big mouth or saying whatever's on his mind, like as a young kid. And his dad would like get enraged with him or get really upset with him about that. And there definitely was some like toxic masculinity going on there. And perhaps with the sun trine the ruler of the third house, Kurt was correct in his assumption that his father favored his brothers more than him, or his father actually liked them more than him. And, and that made him angry or mad, and it upset him. What's really interesting about his dad is his dad used to try to force him to do like masculine stuff like wrestling and sport and all of that. Okay, dad is trying Mars and Scorpio. Like his dad always wanted him to do shit like that, but he didn't want to. And his dad tried to force him to be on the wrestling team, and he threw the match, even though Kurt was actually good at wrestling and he probably could have beat the guy. He threw the match on purpose to piss off his father. Now, I think that is very Mercury opposite Pluto. Like, I am going to purposely sabotage something to piss people off. And I also think that is very Mars K2 as well, because K2 is a spiritual planet, and K2 isn't a planet that really wants to fight, and K2 wants to explore the depths of things, but K2 is not really a fighter. And I mentioned earlier in the reading how that Mars was about to go retrograde in Scorpio like 2 weeks after Kurt's birth anyway. So that Mars was really, really slowing down. And, with K2 there as well, the South Node, him giving up when people are trying to fight or people are trying to push him to do things that he doesn't want to do, that's very Pisces as well. Like, to kind of give up if it's like, I don't want to do this. And so, his father with the sun trine Mars, like trying to make him be masculine or getting along with his sibling better because his sibling is more athletic or masculine or whatever. But then Kurt purposely throwing a wrestling match and losing just to piss off his dad, which I think is very Mars K2 in Scorpio, because Scorpio is definitely a sign of, cutting your nose off to spite your face, right? Like, oh, I don't like what you're forcing me to do. I don't like how you're trying to take power and control over me. And so I'm going to deliberately lose this match and completely give up. And so that, so that basically like, you don't get what you want. Like, I don't care if I get humiliated by losing this match. It doesn't matter. Like, the greater purpose is I get to piss you off by intentionally sabotaging something. Mercury opposite Pluto, Mars K2 in Scorpio connected to the father. It's like, I'm going to lose this match, even though I could maybe even win it. I'm going to intentionally lose it. And so I think that that's very Scorpionic that he did that. And it's interesting, like in the movies and stuff about his life, when they're interviewing his family, they pretty much accuse him of bullying his siblings. And they also talk about him when he's younger and he kind of goes off the rails because he's on Ritalin and then his family's rejecting him and they're getting divorced and all this is going on, that even at school, he was like sometimes bullying other males, which, the third house is associated like with our early education. And I just think it's kind of interesting because for a guy who was like pretty chill or passive or not into that like macho crap, all of that. He does have his sun trine Mars, and and maybe and when he's younger, of course, he's hyperactive, he's on Ritalin, he's unhappy that he has siblings, he doesn't want to have these new brothers or these new siblings. And so he's mad and he's picking on them. And that's part of the reason why his dad is like, you can't stay here anymore. Like, you need to leave the house. Yeah. And Nebula is saying, LOL, poor Kurt is all water. Yeah, he's all water, And anyway, I think the Mars in Scorpio is interesting because that Mars is ruling his eighth house, and it's the eighth house from the third house is the eighth house from the eighth house. And with the Mars third house connection there, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes where people are taking their own lives. And so anyway, I wanted to touch on the Mars K2 because Kurt would also like hate things with a passion. And I think, Mars and Scorpio can definitely hate things very furiously. And K2 wants to cut things off, or, the way that he would express his anger or his rage may be very different with the South Node there. Or there's something with his siblings that relates to a past life, a situation with siblings and brothers that already has him pissed off. And in this lifetime, it's still echoing into this lifetime as well and causing issues for him. And K2 can be where we're not acting like ourselves because he's genuinely like an empathetic, caring guy, but sometimes where we find K2, we're not really acting as ourselves or acting as we normally would. Like, K2 is a multicolored planet, and it's very colorful in the way it expresses itself. And so it comes out differently, or his anger may come out differently there, or it comes out towards his siblings because it is in the third house. And Nebula says, I'm going to show you I can win and lose on purpose to piss you off. Exactly, right? Exactly. Like, that is so Mars and Scorpio. I also think it's very like ruler of his first house, Mercury opposite Pluto. Like, oh, you think I'm gonna, you think you're gonna overpower me and tell me what to do? Oh, hell no. Like, I'll just throw the match. I don't care, like that type of thing. And I think him and his father would get into power struggles like that, like often. Like giving up on purpose is very Mars South Node, like giving up on something on purpose and just saying fuck it and out of animosity. In Scorpio, definitely. And anyway, so those are some things about the Mars K2, and we're going to look at, I want to show you guys right now. Oh, Nebula, you have to head out. Well, thank you for your comments. Thank you very much. And if you're here and if you want to comment on the chart, please do. It makes everything like so much more fun with the comments. So thank you for your comments. Nebula, I'm about to get into like one of the best parts of this reading, so I hope you do catch it later. Right now, I'm going to show you guys because there's a quote from Kurt's suicide note where he mentions how he wishes he could enjoy things more, and how he hates the thought of his daughter becoming destructive like him, like hates to even think of that, and that he's this, destructive death rocker, which is very, Mars and Scorpio, ruler of my ascendant opposite Pluto, like, self-destructive death rocker. He calls himself in his suicide note. And but he mentions something else in his note that I think is interesting. He says, since the age of 7, I've become hateful to all humans. And around the age of 7, I think, is when he was on Ritalin and he was getting diagnosed as ADHD and hyperactive, and he was quote unquote becoming a problem. And it was leading up to his parents' divorce when he was 9, and there was probably already problems in the relationship, but it's interesting because in interviews he's talked about, 9 years old, his parents got divorced. It was like, the worst thing for him. But then he mentions in his suicide note that actually at age 7 is when he started hating all humans. And, that sense of destructive hating of all humans, I want us to take a look at what was going on for him when he was 7 years old, when he made those comments. Okay. And so here are the transits. I just picked like June 22nd of 1974 when he was 7 years old. So I didn't pick, I didn't have a specific day that he said that he started like hating humans or anything like that. I just, picked a day and when he was 7 years old. And we're going to go all the way through to when he was 9 years old and his parents got divorced. Okay. And, what's really interesting is I kept mentioning in the reading about, Kurt, like growing up, his parents saying, oh, wow, he's very sensitive and empathic and caring and generous towards people. And I pointed out to you guys, how his ruler of his ascendant is in a trine with that moon. Okay. And his moon in Cancer, like very caring, very loving. He's also in a trine to this Jupiter in Cancer too, very empathetic, loving, caring person. But starting in 1974, when he started to have a hatred towards all of humanity, what was going on at that time, guys? You will not believe it. We have Saturn in Cancer going on at that time. And from the years of 1974 to 1976, when his parents are getting divorced, that Saturn is going to go over his moon in Cancer and his Jupiter in Cancer multiple times, retrograde over it, go back over it. And so he's talking about a moon Saturn transit that he had starting at 7 years old is when he started to have a hatred for all of humanity. And, nothing will say like, I hate people, because the moon in the chart actually represents people, like human beings, the populace, the crowd, people in general. Like, and Saturn does have to do with hatred, and it does have to do with, it has to do with losing faith in things, and it has to do with, bitter realities being forced upon us. It has to do with, seeing the ugly side of things, and he maybe was born with a very optimistic temperament with the Mercury trine the moon and trine Jupiter. And, he had a very, especially when it came to family, keep in mind the ruler of the fourth house is Jupiter, which represents the fourth house does have to do with family. Now, over those 2 years, as Saturn is in Cancer, it's over his moon and over his Jupiter that his family is destroyed and the divorce happens. And it happens to coincide with the moon Saturn transit that he's having as well. And, it was interesting because I mentioned there was another astrologer who said, he's actually in a really positive relationship to his family with the Mercury trine Jupiter, but it's retrograde, which is causing a reversal of fate, which, I can see that too. But I also think, a Saturn transit over the moon and Jupiter is at the same time while he was going to experience that extreme hatred towards humanity. That Saturn transit sure does say a lot over his moon and Jupiter, especially since Jupiter is ruling the fourth house, and Jupiter also has to do with optimism and faith. And Saturn is like, showing the reality of life and showing the difficulties and squashing the optimism and the hope. And, he was having a very difficult Saturn transit at only 7 years old. And I think, that really did contribute to what he was going through. I also want to show you guys another thing. So at that time, too, that all of that started, he was starting to have eclipses in his fourth house and 10th house. Of course, we know the fourth house has to do with home. And that started to get real shaky and real rocky. And if I move this, I went too far. Okay. If I go back and look at, here he is in 1975 when he's 8 years old. And again, that Saturn is just creeping. It's still in orb with his moon, and it's heading towards Jupiter. And in 1976, when his parents finally get divorced, is the exact year that Saturn is right on his Jupiter. So in May of 1976, when he's 9 years old, Saturn is right on top of his Jupiter, which is the ruler of his fourth house of family. And at that time that the family is breaking apart, at that time, the hope and the optimism and the togetherness, Jupiter and Cancer of the family, is destroyed by that Saturn transit. And it culminates a 2-year period where Saturn has been going over his moon and over his Jupiter. And it destroyed his family. It tore his family apart and made him very, very sad. And that kind of was like, like his reckoning. Like, I don't have this strong family. I don't have it started to really shake his foundation with that. Now, the other thing I want to point out here too is at that same time that his family was falling apart with that Saturn transit right there, Uranus was moving into Scorpio. And Uranus, you can see Uranus right on top of that Mars there. Now, when he had behavioral problems growing up and he was on Ritalin and, he was picking on his siblings and, he was having like major, he was hyperactive. He wasn't able to sit still. Like Uranus was on top of his Mars in Scorpio. And I think that at the same time, because Uranus was going to continue for the next, Uranus stays in a sign for 7 years. So Uranus was going through his third house of siblings and was hitting his south node, his Neptune, his Mars, all of that. And basically, during that time over the next 7 years, he had a new stepbrother, he had 2 new step siblings, he had all these changes introduced into his world. And they actually went to a therapist, the family did, and his mom and dad with Kurt, and they said, he's not doing well with these new siblings. Like, he needs just a single family home. And, the therapist was actually telling his parents to get back together weirdly. And they're like, no, they didn't want to. But at the same time that was going on, you can see the Mars in Scorpio is being overstimulated by that Uranus in Scorpio. And that probably just created more situations of him acting out and him being disruptive. And like we said, the third house has to do with our early education, like being disruptive towards people at school, being disruptive in the home, being hyperactive, not getting along with the siblings. Like, it triggered all of that as that was going on. And what's interesting is that the eclipses during that next period after his parents got divorced, when he was trying to commingle in a new family and all of that, the eclipses were also happening in the third houses of siblings. And so, the North Node and the South Node were there, and eclipses were happening there. Now, 18 years later, when he would take his life, the eclipses were again happening in the third and ninth house. So I think that is interesting as well. And that may say something deeper about the things, there's this whole thing with the 27 Club and people who die at 27 years old. And it's not just Kurt Cobain, but many other, musicians and really talented young people overdosing, dying at the age of 27. And I think that's interesting in a way, because if you look at this cycle of eclipses happening every 18 to 19 years, perhaps something that happened when they were 8 or 9 years old is now being re-triggered when they're 27 years old at 18 years later when the eclipses are happening in the same spot. And 18 is also the number, like when we're officially declared an adult or when we like go out of the house. And I don't know, I just think that that's interesting about that too. Like with the 27 club, because they're all having eclipses in the same spot that they would have been having when they were 8 or 9 years old. So what happened at 8 or 9 years old? What trauma, what event, what major event happened? And for Kurt Cobain, that was the divorce of his parents and the introduction of all these new siblings into his life. And yeah, so we have that going on. Now, speaking of 18 years later, when he did go and take his life, I want to show you guys his solar return that year. And this is not to glorify what happened in any way. I want to show you guys something here, okay? And so Kurt Cobain died in 1994, in April of 1994. Now, his last solar return that he had before he died, that would have been in effect when he died, was his solar return on February 20th of 1994. And so what I have up now on the screen is I have his natal chart on the inner wheel, and then I have his solar return chart for the year that he died. Now, one thing we look at right away when we're doing solar return work is we look at where is the ascendant for the current year coming up in the natal chart. Now, for those of you that are keen, you already would have noticed that the solar return ascendant for 1994 is at 1 degrees Aries. Now, Aries is, of course, falls in his 8th house of death and rebirth, but mainly death, and as it relates to traditional astrology. Now, he had an 8th house rising year. It basically was a death year for him. Now, that is not to say if you have an 8th house rising year that you're going to be faced with your death. Like, my boyfriend just had an 8th house rising year this last year, and he did lose, 2 family members who were much older in age. They passed, and he did receive an inheritance, which is, very 8th house. So it doesn't necessarily mean like your death, but it could be the loss of something or the need to have to let go of something. And a lot of people said that even in that year that Kurt was trying to break up Nirvana, like he was trying to break up the band. His relationship with Courtney was really like on the rocks at the time. They were fighting a lot. There were rumors of divorce. Like, he was having an 8th house year. Not only on his solar return was he having an 8th house rising year. So that means Mars is the ruler of that year. And again, we remember that connection between the 3rd and 8th house and how that can show up in times where there are people that unalive themselves. And so we can see that connection there. He has a Aries rising year, and it is triggering that Mars in Scorpio, that, perhaps that feeling of wanting to give up or things not being worth it anymore. And I think, he was facing like a lot of issues because right before he died, they'd had an intervention on him, and they were all, and Courtney was basically telling him, look, if you don't go to rehab, I'm going to like take our daughter from you. And Courtney Love, in her like eulogy or her speech or whatever she was saying, she basically mentioned that, 1980s tough love doesn't work. And it's so interesting because we have Venus, Saturn. Venus, Saturn is very much like a tough love kind of a situation. And, she did tell him, like, if you don't get help, like, you're not going to see our daughter anymore. And anyway, like, so there was a lot of things that a lot of people confronted him, and he was pissed off because he's like, you guys are all hypocrites. Half of you in this room are addicts as well. Like, there was just a whole thing going on. But I also think, it wasn't just the 8th house rising year that he was having that was triggering this Mars. He was also heading into his Saturn return, and Saturn was on his sun. Saturn was at 2 degrees Pisces on his sun in Pisces. And I think that also like the depression and the pain and the suffering and the anguish of, Saturn coming back over him again. And we know what happened, when he was 7, 8, and 9 years old. When Saturn was going over his moon and Jupiter, it was like the worst thing of his life. And now we've got Saturn going on his sun, feeling like everything's hopeless, nothing is worth it anymore. And what's interesting as well is that, with that eighth house rising year, it wasn't, Kurt killed himself or, unalived himself in early April of 1994. But before that, there'd been multiple times already in the month of March after this solar return had kicked in where he was, threatening to off himself. At one point in Rome, he fell into a coma because he took too many sleeping pills. And it's because, you can see that the North Node is on this Neptune and falling into a coma with Pluto there. And, Jupiter is right there too. So when he fell into a coma in Rome earlier that year, he didn't die. Like Jupiter was there. So, he didn't pass, but he did fall into a coma. Look at that lineup of planets on Neptune there, on his natal Neptune. But it was his own actions of taking his own life that ended up ending his life. But that year was already looking really, really challenging for him. And, there was already multiple instances before he hit the beginning of April where his life was in danger, and like he kept waking up or he kept coming out of it with that Jupiter there. But, that's with the Rahu, with the eclipses happening right there on his Neptune, with the Pluto there, like him falling into a coma, but then somehow coming out of it, but then going on to take his own life. So what an eighth house year. He was facing the end of Nirvana. He was facing possibly the end of his marriage. He was, like overseas and unhappy. And I talked about that earlier, where the ruler of his ninth house is the Venus, and it is in a conjunction with Saturn, which is the worst malefic in the chart by sect. And, how unhappy he was being overseas and how unhappy he was traveling. And so I think just even looking at his solar return for 1994 is very powerful and shows you already where, he's having problems and issues in 1994, but it just kind of got worse, and like he did, like I don't know if he was expected to come out of that coma that he got into when he was in Rome, but he has Jupiter there. So he comes out of the coma, which is interesting in and of itself. And, I really want to point something else out too, you guys, as it relates to locational astrology. And for those of you that study astrocartography, locational astrology, I want to share something with you guys on that. Because keep in mind, Kurt Cobain is in a Mars rising, Aries rising solar return year in 1994 when he's overseas and he is in a coma in Rome. Now, as a Mars rising year, solar return year, it would be activating this Mars in Scorpio. Now, I want us to take a look at the astrocartography for Rome, because Rome is the place where he went into a coma. Now, astrocartography here's a map, right? And in astrocartography, we lay over the lines of the planet, over, places. Basically, you type in the birthday and the lines of your planetary chart show up on a map, and you're able to analyze like what planetary influences are in particular places that you want to travel. Now, keep in mind, his Mars line is running very close to Rome. It's pretty much, there's Rome right there where my mouse is, and there's his Mars line, that red line down the middle of the page. And keep in mind, he's in a Mars rising 8th house year. And, that he hates that Mars is in his third house, which the third house is associated with travel. A lot of people are like in astrocartography are like, you may not want to go to where your Mars line is because there may be violence against you there. There may be bad situations that happen. There may be, it is a place where, things could get out of hand. And things definitely did get out of hand for him while he was in Europe. Now, that Mars line is really going to be impacting. It's close enough to Spain to be impacting when he was in Spain. And he's like, I hate everything and I hate everyone. And he called Courtney. And then that Mars line, it's interesting because he was in Rome when he had that near-death experience. Like, he took too many sleeping pills. He drank too much champagne. He ended up going into a coma. They had to pump his stomach and he nearly died. And I think it's interesting because just with his natal chart, that Mars line is right next to Rome. And he did have a Mars rising year, and it is rising in his 8th house. And so, like going over to a place and traveling over to a place near your Mars line when you're having an 8th house, Mars rising year, maybe not the greatest, moment or the best thing for yourself. And as I even mentioned earlier, like his experiences of traveling overseas or being in Europe, like he already hates it anyway. The ruler of the 9th house was Saturn. He misses his family. He doesn't want to be there. He misses his wife. She comes to join him in Rome, but he takes too many sleeping pills, and 5:30 a.m. she finds him on the floor passed out and rushes him to the emergency room, and that's it. Like that's what happened. And basically he's right there on his Mars line and in Rome when he's in Rome. And so I just think that that's interesting. And there's also a moon Pluto Paran there. And at that time I think he also felt that his like relationship or family was ending, or Courtney may possibly leave him. There's just a lot of other stuff going on there too. And so all of that kind of coming to a head while he was in Rome near his Mars line, he goes into a coma. Okay. And, as we can see, Neptune is also there in Scorpio with Mars, and he's got this planetary, he's got the Pluto in the North Node on Neptune. He falls into a coma, but he wakes up. He's got Jupiter there, so he doesn't die. But then, he's still an 8th house rising year. And so, yes, he eventually does, a few months later, he does, take his life. But you can see even with the Sun-Saturn conjunction with the 8th house rising year, like, losses or tough situations happening to him that probably remind him of the past and remind him, when he was 8 or 9 years old and he like hated everything and hated everyone, and, it was pretty miserable. And he did write about that in his note that he left. And so, you guys, that is what I have to share with you pretty much on the chart. And I hope that was informative for you. And I do appreciate those that left comments. And if you're here and you want to leave me a parting comment or have anything that you'd like to share about, I am happy to hear that and take that feedback. And but anyway, thank you all so much for being here today, and I wish you all a very wonderful week ahead, and thank you for sharing this moment with me. Wishing you the best. Take care. Bye-bye.